Hi, my name is Marianne Krasny, and I'm sitting here in my office at Cornell University in the Department of Natural Resources, where I'm a professor and also the director of the Civic Ecology Lab. And today I'm going to be talking to you about community assets or community wellness and urban environmental education. So when we think about environmental education and wellness, we often think about individual wellness. So about our physical health, our mental health, our emotional and cognitive health. And this actually can be impacted by time spent in nature, as would occur through environmental education, including in cities. So there's been some research that you don't need a sort of big dose of nature necessarily to achieve some of the cognitive and other benefits. And this is the research that was compiled by Richard Love when he talked about nature deficit disorder and Last Child in the Woods. But you can also think about community wellness as an outcome of EE. So we're going from the individual level to the community level to the group level. And when we think of community wellness and urban EE, we want to think about, well, what are some of the outcomes, the community wellness outcomes, and how can we measure them? So there was some really interesting research that Francis Kuo and our colleagues at the University of Illinois conducted back in 1998. And they were working in Chicago, and they were working in public housing, low-income housing. And the residents in these apartment buildings, they were assigned randomly to any apartment building, but some of them happened to end up in apartment buildings that were around courtyards that had sort of no greenery at all. But then there was others that just by chance ended up in apartment complexes that had a little bit of urban green space, a little bit of green space in the courtyard. It could be some trees or some other plantings. And what Professor Kuo did, along with her colleagues, is they observed the residents of these apartment buildings, both those in the courtyards with no greenery and in the courtyards with some green space. And what they found was that for those residents that had green space, they actually developed more neighborhood social ties or sort of more connections with each other, which is part of social capital. And they also developed more of a sense of community and a sense of belonging. So, but we can go back even further in this type of research to the early 1970s. And there was a guy named Charles Lewis, and he was an urban horticulturalist. So he was working in New York City and in Chicago. And he asked people in these cities to, or at least in New York, to enter a gardening contest, so an urban gardening contest. And these were people, the gardening contest included people living in these low-income public housing. And so they didn't have a lot of green space, but they made these little garden boxes. They planted flowers in garden boxes. But they didn't just enter the contest and try to have the nicest garden boxes. They also became very protective of these garden boxes. And so they actually would enlist sort of the rowdy kids in the housing complex to ask them to guard their garden boxes so nobody would vandalize them. And then they even went further, and they started taking sort of care of other public spaces, like painting some of the common areas in the apartment complexes. So this kind of actually feeling that I can make a difference, even in very low-income neighborhoods where there might be sort of a lot of what we call incivilities, like vandalism, maybe people harassing others on the street, litter, broken windows. Well, this idea that people can make a difference in these communities was captured by another group of researchers going back forward in time again to 1998, a group of researchers out of Harvard and the University of Chicago, led by Robert Sampson. And they coined the term collective efficacy for this phenomenon that people in very, what somebody from the outside might look at as sort of disadvantaged neighborhoods would actually take control and do something to improve the neighborhood. And they saw as evidence of collective efficacy things like community gardens. People are taking over vacant lots, making a difference, getting rid of graffiti and broken windows, picking up trash. So we have these sort of phenomenon of collective efficacy is sort of building ties and trust, social capital, and sense of community. But what does all this have to do with urban EE? So there's been some research in EE about trust in particular, and how when people work together towards a common goal, they build trust, including in EE. This particular research from Marcia Mackenzie's lab in Canada was about outward bound programs and how people who rock climb together, they develop trust. But I think more likely to occur in urban environmental education settings is that people are involved in community gardening. They're involved in Friends of Parks groups that are maybe pulling weeds or removing invasive species from a park. And so the learning can occur actually through these what we call civic ecology practices or community environmental stewardship practices. And I think it's very important that this learning also be, wherever possible, intergenerational. Because when that happens, the young people and the old people can form ties, get to know each other, build trust, so they can create social capital. They can also develop a sense of belonging, in the sense that they are contributing to the group, which is essentially what sense of community is about, and they're demonstrating collective efficacy. So in addition to the learning, the environmental education, sort of more traditional outcomes that occur through engaged in these civic ecology practices, we can also see them as practices where people can develop social capital, where they can develop a sense of community, and where they're demonstrating collective efficacy. Thank you.